Hi guys, my name is Karen Akaratovic. I am a biologist for the City of Suffolk Mosquito Control, and today I'm going to be going over the Culex genus, specifically those species that we have in the state of Virginia. So feel free to jot down my contact information if you want, and reach out to me should you have any questions or need clarification on anything that I present here in this presentation. So these are the species that I'll be covering, listed in the order that they appear in the regional ID guide. And those that are underlined here are the most common. Tarzalis, the first one on the list, has been collected very rarely on the south side in, I think, Chesapeake and both Chesapeake and Norfolk. Coronator, the second one on the list, was first found in Suffolk, where I work, in 2016. We found a female in a BG trap, and then another was collected this past year in 2020. Niagara palpas, the other one that's not underlined, was first found in Suffolk, also where I work, in 2017. We found it in BG and CDC traps. And we found multiple specimens throughout our city since then, in 2019 and 2020. So some common life cycle characteristics for all species in this genus is that they all overwinter as adults. And when they come out in the spring and they take their blood meal and their carbohydrate meal, and they're ready to lay eggs, they will lay their eggs in rafts. So like this big collection of eggs stuck together, about 100 to 200 at a time. And they are multivoltine, which means they can produce multiple broods, multiple egg-laying events per year. They tend to breed mostly in freshwater. Some prefer brackish water or can kind of go between the two. Salinarius is one that will do that. Some prefer really stinky, putrid, stagnant water with heavy organic material like dead, decaying leaf matter and stuff like that. So you'll find pipiens and restuans tend to like those types of habitats. And then some prefer water that's really covered with surface vegetation like algae, and that's where you'll find Araticus. And then some are very opportunistic. Coronator and Niagara palpas, for example, have been found in a wide array of habitats, from temporary freshwater floodplain to tire ruts to ditches to some even artificial containers. So it just really runs the gamut with those guys. And many of them are indiscriminate feeders. They feed on a lot of different host types, although they primarily stick to avian and mammalian hosts. They all typically bite at night, and we find most of these species in our CDC and gravid traps. You will find some of them in the BG traps if you're using those, but typically we find them in those too. And they are vectors for a number of diseases, namely West Nile virus, but also St. Louis encephalitis, Eastern equine encephalitis, and Western equine encephalitis if you're further on the western side of the United States. Some common adult morphology. Most of the time when people think of Culex, they think of them as these small, nondescript, boring looking species. I'm going to try to prove that wrong to you today and give you some helpful discerning characters to look for. The palpi, for one, are much shorter than the antenna, as you can see in the picture that's right there. With Anopheles and Toxorhynchides, the palps will be the same length as the proboscis, so that's one way that you can eliminate those two genera when you're trying to look for Culex. They are generally small and dark yellowish brown, although there's some variation that we'll get into. And their abdomen at the tip is blunt or rounded, depending on how you're thinking about it. So when you see that, you can eliminate the Aedes and Saurophora genera. And they have varied banding. So some go straight across, some are narrow, some are have like slightly different patterns, and we'll get into all of that. Also, the wing scales are really narrow in Culex. They're usually all dark. This character can be kind of difficult to determine, especially in the beginning when you're just new to identifying mosquitoes. But once you get used to seeing all the different genera together, you'll be able to see the difference in broad wing scales versus narrow wing scales. And if they're narrow, then you can eliminate Cochleatidia, Mansonia, and Orthopotamia, because they all will have the broad scales. And then some more helpful tips to separate them from other genera. It's very rare, highly unlikely that you would find this genus, Wyomaya. They develop in pitcher plants, and pitcher plants are becoming increasingly rare in Southern Virginia. I think they're actually predicted to be extinct within the next few decades. The character that I have listed, or the description that I have listed here in this slide, is that their abdomen is dorsally dark and they're on the ventral side it's pale. It's not listed in the couplet in your book, but it is a pretty obvious character that you'll see. So if you see something like that, definitely point it out to whoever you're working for and take a closer look. But like I said, it's really rare that you would find these guys. So obviously not a Culex. And then to separate from Mansonia, Aedes, and Xerophora, Culex will have a blunt abdomen, like I said, and then they'll be missing this post-spiracular setae. So here I'm going to circle this. The spherical is that dark oval portion at the top of that circled section, and then the post-spiracular setae is the setae that appears below it. So on the picture on the right that I'm going to circle, you see the spherical, and there is no hair, no setae on that little section below the spherical. And then you can tell them apart from Uranitania because Culex will lack any kind of like bright metallic scales, whereas Uranitania, as you can see in the picture, under the scope they look amazing. It's just a kaleidoscope of colors, blue, purple, green, that you'll see show up, and you will not see that with Culex. You can eliminate Uranitania when you do not see those. The biggest confusion for most people with Culex, I think, is with this genus, is Culceta. They both have blunt abdomens. They both have very similar coloration. But as you get used to looking at more of them, you will notice some differences. The key differences that are shown in your book is that there's no setae under the wing. So if you think of like an armpit, if you open up their wing and you look underneath there, you will see hair on the little wing vein there that the arrow is pointing to if it's a Culceta. Culex will not have hair there. The pre-spiracular area, I don't have a good picture for. You'll just have to check your book for that one. With Culex, their proboscis will also be a lot shorter than Melanura, which, as I said, will come with looking at more specimens. The biggest thing that I was taught to look for is the hairy chest of the Melanura. Culex will not have a lot of setae on the basis sternum or the front coxa, which is, I'll circle it for you here. Let me zoom in on the chest. So this part here, think hairy chest. So underneath their head, on the front part of their thorax, there will be a lot of hair there if it's Culceta. If it's a Culex, you will not see this amount of hair or setae there. Okay, so this brings us to our first species of Culex. This species is Culex tarzalis. It's one of only 2 Culex that we have in the state with banded legs. It's pretty rare. Like I said, it's only been found on the south side in Chesapeake and Norfolk. The hind tarsomeres, which is the last segment on the leg, and hind meaning the back leg, 1 through 5 has both apical and basal pale bands. So in other words, banding that crosses the joint legs. And here I'll point out segments 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So on those 5 segments where it starts and ends, you can see the pale banding that crosses each one of those joints. The next character that you're going to look for to ID this species is the proboscis has a distinct pale band. It goes all the way around. When you hear a band, that means it goes all the way around whatever apparatus we're talking about. And then the palpi will have pale scales. So this speckling is going to be going on with this species. Dark and light scales mixed on the palpi. Also, their costal and subcostal wing veins, which are the top two veins, will have some speckling of pale scales that the arrows are pointing to. The next species on the list is Culex coronator, and like I said, these are also pretty rare. We've only recently discovered these in the state of Virginia. We found one in 2016 in Suffolk, and we found the next in just this past year in 2020. So we've only caught two so far in the entire state that we know of. And they were both caught in November, but as it establishes itself, we should be seeing them caught more frequently in the late summer and fall months. So if the legs are banded similar to how they are with tarzalis, but the proboscis doesn't have a band, it actually has a ventral pale patch. So not a band, only on the underside of the proboscis you'll see a speckling or a section of pale scales. Also, I don't have a good picture of it, but their palpi will not have the pale scales like you see with tarzalis. And then finally, the costal and subcostal veins, the top two wing veins, are all dark. You won't see the speckling like you see with tarzalis. Okay, and then if the legs and the proboscis are not banded, it will be one of the following. So if you get to the part in your book where you're trying to determine where to go, if the hind tarsomeres and proboscis are banded, it will be one of the previous two. If the hind tarsomeres and proboscis are not banded, it will be one of these guys. For Culex territons, they are the only species in this genus that has apical bands on their abdomen. Apical means away. So if you look at this picture here, focusing in on the abdomen, look at one section and you'll see that the section starts out brown and then it goes to pale at the bottom. Sometimes this is easier to see if you look at one of the more distal segments. It tends to be a little bit easier to see as you go further down. So you can see on one of those segments that's highlighted that there are pale scales at the bottom of the segment. So apical away, apical banding, it's a territons. The next one on the list, so the hind tarsomeres and proboscis are not banded. However, these guys will have basal bands on their abdomen. So if you have narrow and indistinct pale basal bands, it could be a salinarius. And the way you determine this is by looking at the midlobe of their scutellum, which is on the picture on the right, will have a basal patch of dark brown scales. If I didn't already say it, basal means body. So apical away, basal body, on the body side of the segment. So here we're looking at the scutellum, and I'm going to circle the section we're talking about. Basal, so towards the body, will be dark brown scales right there on the scutellum. And then you know it could be a salinarius. Some other really key features to look for this species are that the last two abdominal segments are nearly covered with gold scales. I think a lot of people refer to it as their golden butt. So if you look at the end of their abdomen right here that's circled, you see it's got a lot of gold scales covering those last two segments. Also, the mesopimeron, which is over here on the right picture, in a little square box, and I'm going to circle it here. This plate on their thorax has a middle patch of white scales or pale scales that you can see. I have an arrow pointing to it there. So if you see all of those characteristics, then you'll know it's a salinarius. And these two features here especially are very important for the next species that I'm going to talk about, which is Niagara palpas. So as I said, Niagara palpas, it has many of the same morphological characteristics as salinarius. They look very similar, and that's why they share a couplet. But there are some key differences. I'm going to leave this slide up for a second to see if you can spot the first difference. Salinarius is on the left, and Niagara palpas is on the right. I'll give you a clue. It's on the abdomen. I'm going to take this time while you look to mention that this is, like I said, the other new species that we have in the state of Virginia, and it too was discovered here in Suffolk. Like I said, we found several specimens throughout the city in the past couple years, so we would love to hear if our neighbors catch it, so be on the lookout. All right, the first difference is, like I said, on the abdomen, and it is that the abdominal segment 7, so the second to last segment, is mostly dark scaled. Whereas Salinarius will have this golden butt, Niagara palpas will have a darker tail end. The second difference also has to do with the abdomen. If you look at it laterally or from the side, you'll see that it has these basolateral patches. So basal banding, but you can see it more laterally. There are these like triangular bands that increase in size distally as you go further away from, towards the tail end. And then the last difference, I promise this is the last slide on these guys. This is probably the biggest one to look for. They have this rectangular plate, like I mentioned with Salinarius, on their side of their thorax. And with Salinarius, it has that pretty little white patch of scales. With Niagara palpas, it will be missing. So here I'm going to circle the plates for you. This is the mesopimeron. And on Salinarius, it has a patch. On the right is Niagara palpas without a patch. You definitely want to check both sides, like it says on the slide, because it's possible that it was rubbed off. Although I can tell you from IDing thousands of Salinarius, it's very rare for this to be rubbed off. And even if it is, if you're zoomed in enough in your microscope, you'll be able to see the hair follicles where they were attached. So check both sides. Niagara palpas, it'll be very bald and smooth and shiny on that mesopimeron, whereas with Salinarius, you will see the patch. Okay, moving on. Our next species on our list is restuans. And again, their hind tarsomeres and proboscis are not banded. However, with these guys, their abdominal terga have distinct basal pale bands. Remember, with Salinarius and Niagara palpas, their basal banding was pretty narrow. With restuans, it's very distinct. It goes pretty much straight across, all the way down. If unlike Salinarius and Niagara palpas, the Scutalum has light cream color scales at the base of the Scutalum. So here I'm going to circle it. So you'll see cream colored scales, whereas with Salinarius and Niagara palpas, they had dark colored scales here. So once you've decided that it's not a Salinarius or a Niagara palpas, pay close attention to the next couple characters so that you can separate it from the other one that it shares a couplet with. So the main characters to separate restuans from the next species I'm going to show you are these white dots on the scutum. Oh, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. So first we'll talk about the black erect forked scales on the vertex. So on their head, in this little middle section here, it's kind of like triangular section, you will see some head scales, some setae that are standing straight up, and they will be dark scales here. And then the next character that I was going to talk about first was the scutum will have these two round white spots that the arrows are pointing to, and they're not always visible. They can be easily rubbed off by our traps, or it's different, seasonal environmental changes can also affect their prominence. But if you see dots, you can be very certain, or pretty certain, that it's a restuans. In combination with the other characters, you can determine that. If it does not have those characters, but it has, all of the same lead-ins, the hind tarsomeres and proboscis are not banded, the Scutella Midlobe has cream scales, not dark scales, and it has some distinct basal pale banding, it might be a pipiens or Cuenca fasciatus. A quick word I will say about them is these two species, pipiens and Cuenca fasciatus, are near impossible to differentiate morphologically. You have to have DNA capability to tell them apart. And in our area, we are in a zone of hybridization between these two species. The exact range of that hybridization is still being debated and is unknown. Genetic studies are going on to determine that, but what matters to you guys is that we consider it the pipiens complex, and you will generally just hear local biologists refer to them as pipiens. As with many matters in science, this could change going forward, but for now we'll stick with pipiens. So all that said, this species looks very similar to Restuans, but they do share a couplet. So once you've determined they're not a Salinarius or a Niagara palpas, look for the following characteristics. Segments 2 and 3 usually have a central pale scale spot that's separated and has 2 lateral pale spots. And then going further down their abdomen, that kind of separation will be a little less apparent. It'll kind of flow a little bit better. So how I learned it, and I like to think of it as initially you'll see like it looks like a sideways P for pipiens. And then as you move down, I think of the 2 points as the cheer, hip hip hooray, and I just replace it with pip pip. It's cheesy, but it makes it memorable, I think. So hopefully that helps you. Lastly, for this species is the head CD. If you remember before, when I was talking about Restuans, they had those dark erect scales. Well, pipiens will instead have pale scales here. And even if a lot of them are rubbed off, you'll usually see at least 1 or 2 standing up. If it's dark, you know it's a Restuans. If it's pale, then you've got a pipiens. And last but not least is Culex Araticus. They're pretty easy to spot because they are usually the smallest and darkest of this genus. They have a very dark brown, almost black coloration, and then they have these bright, pale white scales that contrast really well with the dark. There's 2 other species in your book that look similar to Araticus. The biggest difference separating them is the broad scales on the head that's shown at the picture on the right. Araticus just has a couple rows of these pale, broad scales. The other 2 are completely covered on their head with these pale scales. And the 2 that I'm talking about are Peccator and Pilosis. Peccator is listed in our state in Virginia, but I've never seen it. I don't know who has. The other is Pilosis, and I'm not 100% on its range, but it has not been reported in the state of Virginia yet. So if you see something that looks like this, it's most likely Araticus. These guys also stand out because they appear to have no abdominal banding looking at them dorsally. If you're looking at them top down, it looks like the picture on the bottom right, where it just looks totally devoid of any pale scales. But if you flip them over or on their side, you'll see the pale basal banding there. So if you look at the picture on the left, you can see the pale banding is showing through on their belly. And then the top right kind of shows it laterally. So if you see it on the side or the underbelly, you'll know that it's an Araticus. So here is a quick, hopefully helpful summary of all of the information that I've just thrown at you. And I'm going to underline the most important characters for each one. So if it has banded legs and a proboscis with a pale band or a ventral patch, it's either a tarzalis or a coronator. If it has apical, so away from the body, abdominal banding, then it's a territons. If it has indistinct basal abdominal bands and the last 2 segments are nearly all gold and the mesopimeron has a middle pale patch, it's a Salinarius. If it also has indistinct basal abdominal bands, but segment 7 is nearly all dark and the mesopimeron does not have a middle pale patch, then it's a Niagara palpas. If it has distinct basal bands, usually 2 white dots on the scutum, and the middle head scales are black, then it's a Restuans. If it has distinct basal bands that are P-shaped and the head scales are pale, then it's a pipiens, or Pipiens quinquefasciatus, Pipiens complex. If it is small and dark with bright white banding that usually wraps around ventrally, then it's an Araticus. And that's it for Culex. I hope this presentation was helpful and is useful to you in your mosquito IDing adventures. My contact information is listed there again. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or if you need any clarification on any of the slides or anything that I've said. And happy IDing. Thank you.